February 1st, 1943. 25,000 feet above Nazi-occupied Europe. The temperature inside the aircraft minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, worse. Second Lieutenant Robert Morgan grips the control yoke of a B-17F Flying Fortress, his leather gloves so stiff with cold they might as well be made of iron. Through the plexiglass nose he can see them coming, black dots growing larger against the winter sky. Focke-Wulf 190s, at least 15 of them. This is the Memphis Belle's 24th mission. One more, just one more, and his crew goes home. But first, they have to survive the next 30 minutes. The German fighters open fire at 500 yards. What Morgan doesn't know yet, what none of them know, is that this moment, this aircraft, will help define how America remembers the Second World War. But the story doesn't begin here, in the frozen terror of combat altitude. It begins years earlier, with a question that seemed almost impossible to answer. How do you build a fortress that can fly? In the mid-1930s, the United States Army Air Corps faced a strategic dilemma. Coastal defense doctrine demanded long-range bombers capable of intercepting enemy fleets far from American shores, but the technology simply didn't exist, not yet. Boeing Aircraft Company, struggling during the Depression, saw an opportunity. Project 299, as it was initially designated, represented a radical departure from existing bomber designs. When the prototype rolled out of Boeing's Seattle factory on July 17, 1935, a Seattle Times reporter took one look at the bristling machine guns, 4.30 caliber positions, later increased to 13.50 caliber weapons, and coined a name that would echo through history: Flying Fortress. The designation itself tells a story of evolution. B-17, the B for bomber, the number indicating it was the 17th bomber design accepted by the Army since 1925. But numbers don't capture what this machine represented: a bet on strategic bombing doctrine, on American industrial might, and on the men who would take it to war. Let me give you the technical specifications that would matter to the men who flew her. The B-17G, the most produced variant, measured 74 feet 9 inches long, with a wingspan of 103 feet 9 inches. 4 Wright-R 1820-97 Cyclone turbo-supercharged radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. Maximum speed, 287 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, though crews rarely pushed her that hard with a full bomb load. Service ceiling, 35,600 feet, high enough to make the air so thin that oxygen deprivation could kill you in minutes. Range, approximately 2,000 miles with a 4,000-pound bomb load, though combat conditions often reduced that figure. But here's what mattered more than any specification. She could take punishment that would tear other aircraft apart and still bring her crew home. The pre-war years saw continuous refinement. The B-17B introduced turbo superchargers. The B-17C added self-sealing fuel tanks, a feature that would save countless lives. The B-17E, entering service in late 1941, marked a major redesign. A larger tail, dorsal and ventral gun positions, and that distinctive tail gun position that gave German fighter pilots a nasty surprise when they attacked from behind. Production numbers tell the story of American industrial mobilization. Boeing's Seattle plant, Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, Vega, a Lockheed subsidiary, in Burbank. By war's end, 12,731 B-17s would roll off these assembly lines, an average of nearly 5 aircraft per day for 4 years straight. But in 1941, as America stood on the precipice of war, nobody knew if these machines would prove the theories that spawned them. August 17th, 1942. 12 B-17Es of the 97th Bombardment Group approached the Rouen-Sotteville marshalling yards in occupied France. This is the 8th Air Force's first heavy bomber mission over Europe. 18 aircraft took off, but only 12 made it to target. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing, the theory that motivated bombers could fight their way through enemy defences without fighter escort, was about to face its first real test. Those early missions were learning experiences written in blood and burning aluminum. Brigadier General Ira C. Eaker, commander of 8th Bomber Command, watched his crews return with battle damage and casualty reports that contradicted everything pre-war theorists had promised. The Germans weren't cooperating with American doctrine. The combat box formation evolved from these harsh lessons. 18 to 21 aircraft flying in a precise geometric pattern, positioned so each bomber's guns covered the blind spots of the others. From a distance it looked almost beautiful, a constellation of aircraft moving through the sky in mathematical precision. Up close, maintaining formation in the buffeting prop wash of the aircraft ahead, with fighters attacking and flak bursting all around, it was anything but beautiful. Let me describe what a typical mission felt like, based on dozens of crew accounts, official reports, and post-war interviews, pre-dawn, roused from sleep after maybe 4 hours in a cold Quonset hut somewhere in England. A breakfast you might not keep down, many men couldn't eat before missions. The briefing, target for today, expected opposition, assembly points, call signs. Some men made dark jokes, others fell silent, calculating odds. Takeoff was dangerous even without enemy action. A fully loaded B-17G weighed 65,000 pounds. 32 tons of aircraft, fuel, bombs and ammunition thundering down a runway that never seemed quite long enough. Formation assembly over England could take an hour or more, hundreds of bombers circling, climbing, finding their assigned positions. By the time the formation headed for the Channel, the sun would be up, and every man aboard knew what came next. The English Channel offered a brief respite. Too far for German fighters based in France, not yet in range of the coastal flak batteries. Then the coast of occupied Europe and all hell broke loose. Flak, anti-aircraft artillery, came first. The Germans had perfected the 88mm flak gun, firing shells that burst at predetermined altitudes, sending shrapnel in all directions. You couldn't dodge it, you couldn't shoot back, you just flew through it and hoped. The explosions made black puffs in the air, flak flowers, some men called them, a name that made something deadly sound almost benign. Then the fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf 190s. Later in the war, Me-262 jets that moved so fast you barely had time to track them. The German pilots developed tactics specifically to break up bomber formations, head-on attacks that gave the B-17's nose gunners only seconds to respond, attacks from 12 o'clock high where the bombers' guns had limited traverse, concentrated fire aimed at engines and cockpits. Staff Sergeant John Lucky Luckadoo, a tail gunner with the 100th Bomb Group, later called the Bloody 100th, described it in his memoir. You're standing in the tail, watching fighters come at you from 6 o'clock level. You know they're aiming for you. You're firing back, but you can see your tracers just missing, and theirs just missing you, except some of them aren't missing. You hear the impacts, feel the aircraft shudder. You see holes appearing in the fuselage, and you wonder which burst has your name on it. The temperature at bombing altitude, usually 25,000 to 30,000 feet, hovered around -40 to -50 Fahrenheit. The electrically heated flight suits often failed. Frostbite was common. Men urinated in their flight suits because leaving position to use the relief tube meant losing precious body heat and disconnecting from oxygen. At those altitudes, you had about 15 seconds of useful consciousness without oxygen. Take off your mask to vomit, and many did from stress or air sickness, and you risk passing out. The bomb run itself demanded nerves of steel. For those final minutes approaching the target, the bombardier, lying prone in the plexiglass nose, took control of the aircraft through the Norden bomb sight. No evasive action, straight and level. Every German gun in range knew you couldn't maneuver. Second Lieutenant Howard Snyder, a B-17 pilot with the 306th Bomb Group, later wrote, "Those minutes felt like hours. You could hear and feel every hit. Metal tearing, wind whistling through new holes. You'd see the bomber ahead of you suddenly nose over and spiral down or explode or just disintegrate, and you kept flying straight, because that's what you did." Bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as 4,000 pounds, or 8,000 on some missions, dropped free. Then the turnaway, trying to get back into formation, trying to get home. Some didn't make it. The casualty rates in 1943 were unsustainable. The October 14th, 1943 raid on Schweinfurt, Black Thursday, saw 60 B-17 lost out of 291 dispatched. That's a 20.6% loss rate in a single mission. Statistically, a crew's chances of completing the required 25 missions, later increased to 30, then 35, were slim. The 8th Air Force suffered more casualties than the entire United States Marine Corps in World War II. 26,000 killed, 28,000 wounded or captured. But the bombers kept flying. Why? Partly because they had to. Orders were orders. but partly because of something else, something harder to quantify. Listen to enough veteran accounts and you hear it repeatedly. They kept flying for each other, for the man in the next position, for the crew in the next aircraft. A B-17 carried a crew of 10 men, though this varied by model and modification. Each position had its purpose. Each man was essential. The pilot commanded the aircraft from the left seat, responsible for formation flying, evasive action, and bringing the machine home even when damaged. His co-pilot wasn't just backup. He monitored engine instruments, assisted with control inputs during formation flying, and took over if the pilot was hit. The navigator, stationed in the nose with the bombardier, kept track of position using dead reckoning, radio fixes when available, and visual landmarks when possible. German deception measures, fake airfields, smoke screens, decoy targets, made this harder than it sounds. The bombardier, in those final minutes before bombs away, became the most important man on the aircraft. The Norden bomb site, supposedly capable of dropping a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, an exaggeration, but not by much, was classified technology. Crews were briefed. If you have to bail out, destroy the bomb site first. The flight engineer/top turret gunner sat behind the pilots, monitoring engine performance and manning the top turret, a key defensive position. Technical Sergeant Forrest Vossler of the 358 Bomb Squadron, despite being wounded and partially blinded by flak, continued to defend his aircraft and assist his crew during a mission over Bremen, actions that earned him the Medal of Honor. The radio operator monitored communications, sent position reports, and manned a gun position in later models. When aircraft were hit badly, he often helped wounded crew members to exit points or administered first aid in flight. The ball turret gunner occupied arguably the most terrifying position on the aircraft. The Sperry ball turret, a spherical plexiglass and metal ball mounted under the fuselage, held one man in a fetal position with 2.50 caliber machine guns. He entered through the fuselage, and the turret was then rotated to allow the guns to track enemy fighters. If the aircraft's hydraulics failed, or if the landing gear was damaged, the ball turret couldn't retract. Landing with the ball turret down meant crushing the gunner inside. Staff Sergeant Alan McGee, 303rd Bomb Group, survived a fall from 22,000 feet without a parachute when his B-17 exploded over France, but most ball turret gunners weren't so lucky. Many crews had a standing order. If the hydraulics fail and we can't get you out, we'll try to give you time to bail out before attempting landing. The waist gunners, 2 of them in most models, manned flexible 50 caliber positions on either side of the fuselage. These positions were unheated, fully exposed to the wind that howled through the open windows. Later models had staggered positions to give the gunners more room to operate without hitting each other. The tail gunner sat alone in the tail section, watching for attacks from behind, the most common German approach in the early war years. His position was isolated, cold, cramped. If the aircraft went down and the tail section broke off, not uncommon, he had a better survival chance than most. If the aircraft broke up forward of his position, he was trapped. These weren't supermen. They were farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college students from New England, shopkeepers' sons from Texas. Average age, 22. Many had never been outside their home state before the war. Now they were flying deep into the most heavily defended airspace in history, multiple times per week, knowing that every mission was a roll of the dice. The psychological strain was immense. Today we'd call it PTSD. Then it was flak happy or combat fatigue. Men who'd seen their friends' aircraft explode, who'd heard dying crewmen on the intercom, who'd flown home in aircraft so damaged they shouldn't have been able to fly. These men still had to get up the next morning and do it again. Some broke. There was no shame in it, though some felt shame anyway. Flight surgeons could ground you for psychological reasons, but the process was arbitrary, and many men refused to report symptoms, fearing they'd be thought cowards. Most kept going, mission after mission. They developed superstitions, lucky socks, pre-flight rituals, mascots painted on aircraft noses. They gave their planes names: Hell's Angels, 909, Yankee Doodle, Shoo Shoo Baby, Aluminum Overcast. Some of these aircraft became famous for the number of missions they completed. Most were eventually lost. Let me tell you about some of the aircraft and crews that exemplified both the B-17's resilience and the courage of its men. Memphis Belle is perhaps the most famous. Piloted by Captain Robert K. Morgan, with a crew that included co-pilot Captain James Verinis, and Bombardier Captain Vincent Evans, the Belle completed 25 missions over Europe, the first B-17 in the 8th Air Force to do so with most of her original crew intact. The 25th mission, on May 17, 1943, targeted the submarine pens at Lorient, France. The aircraft and crew returned to the United States for a war bond tour, and Hollywood director William Wyler made a documentary about them that became legendary. The Belle survived the war and now sits in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. But here's what often gets forgotten. The Memphis Belle completed her 25 missions first, partly because she was good, partly because Morgan was an excellent pilot, and partly because she was lucky. Dozens of other aircraft and crews were just as skilled, just as brave, but didn't make it. The celebration of the Belle was also a propaganda necessity. By May 1943, the 8th Air Force desperately needed some good news to sustain morale and public support. All-American of the 97th Bomb Group suffered a mid-air collision with a German fighter over Tunisia on February 1, 1943. The fighter's wing cut through the B-17's fuselage just aft of the bomb bay, nearly severing the aircraft in two. The tail section remained attached only by the control cables and a narrow strip of metal. Pilot Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg kept the aircraft flying for 90 minutes and made a successful emergency landing. Photographs of the damaged aircraft showing the massive structural failure and the tail hanging on by almost nothing became iconic images of the B-17's toughness and the skill of its crews. The old pub, B-17 F-42-3495, flew a mission over Bremen on December 20, 1943, and was badly shot up by German fighters. Half the crew was wounded, one gunner dead in his position. The aircraft fell out of formation, losing altitude, making it an easy target. German fighter pilot Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, already credited with multiple kills that day, moved in for the final attack, and then saw through the shattered plexiglass the wounded crew members trying to save their aircraft. Stiegler, a veteran pilot who had flown in the Spanish Civil War and across multiple fronts, made a choice. He pulled alongside the crippled bomber, gestured to pilot Charles Charlie Brown to head for Sweden, neutral territory, and escorted the B-17 over the German coast, preventing his own flak batteries from shooting it down. Brown nursed the damaged aircraft back to England and never forgot. 46 years later, Brown tracked down Stiegler, and the two became close friends. Stiegler explained his choice. "I didn't have the heart to finish them off. It would have been murder, not combat." This story, detailed in the book A Higher Call by Adam McCoss, demonstrates that even in total war, individual humanity sometimes prevailed. But for every story of miraculous survival, there were many more of loss. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after the 8th Air Force's first mission, saw 60 B-17s lost out of 376 dispatched, with another 100 damaged. The target was ball-bearing factories, critical to German war production. The mission achieved some success, but the cost was unsustainable. German fighter units had refined their tactics. The P-47 Thunderbolt escorts could only accompany the bombers to the German border before having to turn back, fuel exhausted. October 14, 1943. Black Thursday, the second Schweinfurt raid. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17 bombers to destroy the ball-bearing factories again. They lost 60 bombers. That's 600 men killed, wounded or captured in a single day. Another 17 B-17s were damaged beyond repair. German fighter units threw everything at the formations. Head-on attacks by entire squadrons, some fighters carrying 21-centimeter rockets that could destroy a B-17 with a single hit. These losses forced a strategic reassessment. Long-range fighter escorts became a priority. The P-51 Mustang with drop tanks could escort bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back. By early 1944, the equation had changed. The Luftwaffe fighter force, bled white by mounting casualties and increasingly outmatched by escorting fighters, began to crumble. But the B-17 crews still flew through flak, still faced determined resistance, still died in significant numbers until the very end of the war. The B-17 evolved constantly throughout the war, each variant addressing lessons learned in combat. The B-17E, entering service in late 1941, featured major redesign: larger vertical stabilizer and rudder, repositioned waistgun windows, remote-controlled ventral turret, later replaced with a manned bull turret, and increased armour protection. Total production, 512 aircraft. The B-17F, introduced in early 1942, incorporated improved turbo superchargers, paddle blade propellers for better performance, reinforced landing gear, and additional armour. The F model saw the most varied modifications, with different engine types and numerous field modifications to address specific tactical needs. Total production, 3,405 aircraft. This was the model that bore the brunt of the 1942-1943 combat, including the devastating losses over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The B-17G, appearing in late 1943, addressed the most critical vulnerability: head-on attacks. The G model added a chin turret under the nose with 2.50 caliber guns, operated remotely by the bombardier. This addition, along with defensive tactics refinement and improved fighter escort, significantly reduced losses from frontal attacks. The G model became the most produced variant, 8,680 aircraft built by Boeing, Douglas and Vega. Defensive armament evolved from 4.30 caliber guns in the prototype to 13.50 caliber, Browning and 2 machine guns in the B-17G. Each gun could fire approximately 750 to 850 rounds per minute to an effective range of about 1,000 yards. A fully armed B-17G bristled with firepower, chin turret, top turret, ball turret, 2 waist guns, tail guns, and nose cheek guns. The combined weight of defensive ammunition alone approached 4,000 pounds, but guns added weight, reduced range, and didn't make the aircraft invulnerable. The debate over whether heavy defensive armament was worth the performance penalty continued throughout the war. Some crews removed guns to increase speed and altitude capability. Others added more guns through field modifications. There was no single right answer. It depended on the mission, the expected opposition, and commander preference. Engine reliability improved throughout the war. The Wright R-1820-97 Cyclone turbo supercharged radial engine became increasingly dependable, though engine failures were never eliminated entirely. Many B-17s returned on 3 engines, some on 2. There are documented cases of B-17s making it back to England on a single functioning engine, though such instances required exceptional piloting skill and a good deal of luck. The Norden bomb sight, technically the Norden Mark 15, was one of the most classified technologies of the war. An analog computer using mechanical gyroscopes, it calculated bomb trajectory accounting for altitude, airspeed, wind drift, and target motion. When functioning properly and operated by a skilled bombardier, it was remarkably accurate. However, clouds, smoke, evasive action, and combat stress all reduced effectiveness. Post-war analysis showed actual accuracy fell significantly short of theoretical precision, but it was still far superior to anything else available at the time. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany remains historically controversial. Did it shorten the war? Did the results justify the cost? From a purely industrial standpoint, the effects were mixed. Despite intensive bombing, German war production actually increased through mid-1944, partly due to dispersal of factories, partly due to Albert Speer's rationalization of production methods, and partly due to the use of slave labor. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, bombed at such high cost, weren't the single point of failure American planners believed them to be. Germany had stockpiles, alternative suppliers, and the ability to redesign equipment to use fewer bearings. However, the indirect effects were significant. The Luftwaffe was forced to commit enormous resources to air defense: fighters, pilots, ammunition, fuel that couldn't be used on the Eastern Front or in other theatres. By 1944, the German fighter force was being bled to death by the escort fighters protecting the bomber streams. The loss of experienced pilots, men who couldn't be replaced with similar skill levels, crippled the Luftwaffe's effectiveness. The bombing campaign also disrupted transportation networks, particularly rail systems, which had cascading effects on German military logistics. And there was a psychological dimension. The sight of American bombers over Germany in daylight, with German fighters unable to stop them, demonstrated to both German civilians and military personnel that the war was lost. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, believed the strategic bombing campaign validated the concept of air power as a decisive independent force. Some post-war analysts agreed. Others pointed to the massive resources consumed: aircraft, fuel, bombs, and most importantly trained air crews. and questioned whether those resources might have been better employed elsewhere. What's not debatable? The men who flew the missions didn't have the luxury of strategic analysis. They did their jobs day after day at a cost that can be measured in casualty reports, but never fully understood by those who weren't there. While the B-17 is primarily associated with the European theatre, it saw significant early service in the Pacific, though it was eventually superseded there by the longer-range B-24 Liberator and B-29 Superfortress. On December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, a flight of 12 B-17 from the 38th and 88th Reconnaissance Squadrons happened to be arriving at Hickam Field from California. They flew into the middle of the attack unarmed and low on fuel. Miraculously, most survived, though several were damaged by friendly and enemy fire. Some landed at Hickam under attack, others found alternative landing sites. This baptism by fire was an inauspicious introduction to combat for the type. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, B-17s operated from bases in Australia and New Guinea, attacking Japanese shipping, air bases, and installations. The long overwater flights tested both aircraft and crew endurance. Navigation was particularly challenging over the trackless Pacific, with few reliable landmarks. Many aircraft were lost not to enemy action, but to navigation errors, weather, and mechanical failures over water. The 19th Bomb Group, operating in the Southwest Pacific under appalling conditions, inadequate spare parts, tropical diseases, Japanese air attacks on their bases, kept fighting despite overwhelming odds. These crews received far less attention than their counterparts in Europe, but their courage was equal. By late 1943, the B-24 Liberator, with its longer range and slightly higher service ceiling, became the primary heavy bomber for Pacific operations. B-17s were gradually transferred to the European theatre or relegated to secondary roles: training, transport, and air-sea rescue. Some B-17s were modified as search and rescue aircraft, with lifeboats that could be dropped to downed air crews. These unglamorous missions saved hundreds of lives. For the crews who survived their tour of duty, 25 missions initially, later increased to 30, then 35, rotation back to the United States often brought mixed emotions. Relief, certainly. Survivor's guilt, absolutely. Many men felt they were abandoning their comrades still fighting. Some volunteered for additional tours. First Lieutenant William Lawley Jr., 364 Bomb Squadron, flew his first tour, returned to the States, then came back for a second tour. On February 20th, 1944, over Leipzig, his B-17 was badly damaged, co-pilot killed, and Lawley himself wounded. With the aircraft nearly uncontrollable, he kept it flying long enough for his wounded crew to bail out, then landed the crippled bomber at a forward base. He received the Medal of Honor. Others never got the chance to rotate home. The casualty rate among 8th Air Force bomber crews was approximately 12 to 13% per mission in 1943. Simple probability, over 25 missions, your chances weren't good. Many crews were lost on their first or second missions, never having the chance to learn the skills that might have saved them later. The aircraft themselves often didn't survive either. Combat losses, training accidents, wear out from intensive operations. By war's end, the majority of B-17s built had been lost or scrapped. Only a handful survive today in flying condition, maintained by dedicated organizations and individuals at enormous expense. The Commemorative Air Force, the Collings Foundation, before the loss of 909 in 2019, and other groups have kept these machines flying so that future generations can see and hear what a formation of B-17s looked like, sounded like. Let me give you some numbers and then let me tell you why those numbers don't really convey the full story. The 8th Air Force, operating primarily from England, lost approximately 6,000 heavy bombers during the war, B-17 and B-24s combined. About 47,000 aircrew members were casualties, killed in action, died of wounds or killed in accidents. Another 18,000 were wounded. Approximately 28,000 became prisoners of war, many after horrific experiences bailing out over enemy territory, wounded, watching friends die. The survival rate for 8th Air Force bomber crews through mid-1943 was approximately 25 to 30% for completing a full tour. That means 2 out of every 3 crew members you trained with, lived with, flew with, would not complete their tours. They'd be dead, missing, or prisoners. Now, let me tell you what those numbers mean. They mean 10 men in an aircraft. A crew that becomes closer than family because they depend on each other absolutely. They mean the tail gunner who writes letters home to his girl every evening after debriefing, planning their future. They mean the radio operator who shares his mother's cookies from a care package. They mean the pilot who takes extra time in training to make sure his co-pilot is really ready. They mean the navigator who double-checks his calculations because 10 lives depend on him bringing them home. And then one day, one mission, they don't come back. And Me-109 gets through the fighter screen. A flak burst hits the oxygen system, and the crew starts to pass out before they realise what's happening. The controls freeze up at the worst possible moment. An engine catches fire, and the extinguisher doesn't work. Or sometimes, simply, catastrophically, the aircraft disintegrates in a fireball at 25,000 feet and nobody has time to bail out. The men who survived carry memories that never fade. Even 70, 80 years later, you can find interview footage of surviving B-17 crew members, men in their 90s now, and when they talk about those missions, their voices change. Some cry, some stare at something only they can see. They remember friends' names, aircraft numbers, dates, in perfect detail. The human mind is remarkably efficient at storing traumatic memories. Today, the B-17 occupies a special place in American memory of World War II. It represents, for many, the industrial might and moral clarity of the American war effort, a symbol of when America knew who the enemy was and fought with determination to defeat it. But symbols can simplify. The real story of the B-17 is more complex, more human. It's a story of young men who did a nearly impossible job under horrific conditions because they believed, rightly or wrongly, that it mattered. It's a story of American industry transforming from Depression-era stagnation to wartime productivity that still astounds. It's a story of technological innovation, tactical evolution, and strategic reassessment. It's a story of courage and terror, survival and loss, heroism and simple human endurance.